Right, so today is the 27th of September, is that right?
Yep.
And I'm interviewing Joe McGeer on education. So, Joe, what made you want to chase your family roots?
I think it was my own family history, and I was aware of the fact growing up that although I lived 2 streets from where we're sitting just now in George Street, everybody was the same. Everybody worked in the shipyards, as did my father. But I was also aware that my father was slightly different, that he had come from the United States, and this story was around about my grandmother who being killed in a car crash in the United States in Philadelphia in 1929. So that as I was growing up, I was aware that I was slightly different, and that triggered my interest in family history to find out, well, why did he wind up here, why? And like all of us, I fell into the same trap. I asked some questions when I was young, but probably fell into the same trap as everyone else of not asking enough questions. When you had that, not my father died quite young, he was 57, but when you had your grandmother, your great-grandmother at the age of 80, you should have sat down, we should have done this with them. So it was that, plus I was always interested in history, and even when I was growing up, people would gather. I remember my mother and father family, big families, 10 brothers and sisters, and everyone else was the same. They would gather in the house and just sit and talk, and they would tell you stories, particularly the Second World War, the First World War. So that's where the interest came in, and that's why I did some family research, but never really got into it until I joined this project.
So, what made you volunteer for the Identity Project?
I was looking for something like this, and I noticed my wife and I were at the Doors Open Day, and I met Kay, and she had the Morton book and the other book on Port Glasgow and Newark, and I read them very quickly because I'm both a Morton supporter and come from Port Glasgow. So when I read them, I thought, this is quite good, and a wee compliment to Kay here. She's very enthusiastic. She kind of draws you into these things. And I'd looked at various other things because I'm retired, and I thought, no, I'll have a go at this, see what happens. And I'm glad I did, because it's not just there's professionals, if you like, yourself and Kate, all the rest of it, but it's the rest of the group. Because when I joined the group, I didn't know anyone, and then I thought, right, I wonder what they're like, what they'll know, and I thought they were much like me, beginners, beginning to learn about their family, and some are. But my goodness, they're knowledgeable. And I suddenly realised that they were a resource as well, because you just seen it yourself. You can sit in there and you can say, does anyone know? And within 30 seconds you're getting answers, So once I realised that the people themselves, plus the great fun, they were a real asset in providing information and techniques and so on, I was kind of hooked by that. So I'm keen to keep going with it.
How did you go about starting your search? Was there a website or a library that you used?
The Scotland's People was the one that I started to use. But I did the simple thing. I went and sat in front of my aunts and uncles and said, tell me. So I did that, and then I began just the legwork, if you like, filling in the boxes, who was born, how many brothers and sisters were, that kind of thing. And that's interesting to some extent, but you need the colour. I'm far more interested in finding that some aunt or uncle in the past, was born 2 days before the wedding or after the wedding. I'm more interested in that than the fact that they went to school for 5 years or whatever. So once you get that and you begin to fit them around the family stories, people begin to emerge. Characters, people who've got what did they do in their lives? What did they think? And when you begin to put that together, you get kind of hooked. But I was warned before I started. A friend of mine did it a number of years ago. Said, "Be careful. It's like a drug. You really get hooked by it," and I have been.
So I hear there's a wee bit of a funny story about your ancestor, Robert Patton. Can you tell us a wee bit about that?
Came from Ballycastle, and he was quite a frightening man to deal with. But some of it, and a lot of it, has got to do with the history, his personal history and what he was like. And to be perfectly honest, I used to avoid him if I possibly could. And he's a man that, as I say, I tried to avoid because he was quite intimidating, he was quite frightening. And he had fire in his belly. That was the one thing that I knew that he was. And I never really kind of worked out what drove him, what motivated him. But I think it was a simmering resentment against the conditions that he and his parents found themselves in. So the family up sticks and move to Port Glasgow. But he became aware of discrimination really quite quickly. Now, I don't know what it was that made him aware of. Maybe he just sensed it more than others. And I think he was discriminated against in terms of getting jobs and so on. So I think getting knockbacks in particularly for jobs in the yards, because my understanding that he was quite a clever man, although he was a not terribly well educated man. Didn't get a chance to do much formal learning, reading and so on. But I know he was a clever man, even my memory of speaking to him. So he developed this burning resentment, and it was directed at that time. Religion was a huge issue. It was to some extent when I was growing up, but not as much as it was in the 1900s and so on, where there was competition for jobs and there were communities, and society was very rigid in many ways, And one of the things they used to do, he had a resentment, a bitter resentment against the Irish order. But probably it was quite common at the time. And one of the stories is of him, and I've tried to research this, although it's come from many members of the family, is in the pub 3 doors down from where we are, called the Prince of Wales. You'll see it was called that way back 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. And the story is that he was drinking, and they all drank wine in those days, not a nice Sancerre or something like that. We're talking about the fortified stuff that arrived in Glasgow from South Africa, the Langlik Fort Crown. It came in big boxes this size, jelly. It's the kind of sherry wine, but it's firewater. And the story was that he's been drinking this stuff from 11 o'clock onwards, and as the Orange Order's coming past in the parade along Bay Street, he runs out and tries to jump through the big drum. And as my grandmother had it, I don't know whether him and the drummer wind up in the dock, which was just across at the end of the street at that point, or whether that was his intention. But anyway, he winds up. This disrupts the parade, and he winds up in the jail overnight. And he's a man that's, you wouldn't say you're terribly proud of him, but he's my great grandfather. And I was interested in what was it like for that man in the 1870s when he was at school. Obviously I'm interested in education because I became a teacher. And the 1872 Education Act is very, very important. It was one of the first in the world that made, in Scotland, this was one of the first education acts in the world that says all children go to school. It's compulsory, and you go between the ages of 5 and 13. I was always under the impression that what happened was the attendance rates, which would have been, say, averaging 40% prior to that, through the 1850s, 60s, that kind of thing, would suddenly go to 100% because they introduced attendance officers. Attendance officer, if a child was absent, they're pretty largely gone now. If a child wasn't at school for, say, 3 days, this man or woman came to the house. Where's Joe? He's not been at school. You haven't sent a note in, what's going on? The attendance officers were brought in to enforce the 1872 Act. That's what their job was. So I thought, I'd always blindly assumed, that an act that says you have to go to school and a man coming along knocking your door saying, get your child to school, would have increased attendance rates from 50, 60% to 100%, near enough. It wasn't like that. Of course it wasn't like that. In poor areas, the children who are perhaps aged 10 or 11 were already working. The jobs, they needed the money. But the amount of money actually could often make the difference between the family eating that week and not eating, especially if you had 2 or 3 children. And although education was made compulsory, it wasn't made free. And I always assumed it was. It wasn't until I back and read the Act and some of the things around it. You still had to pay 2 pence. Now, I've actually not worked out whether that was 2 pence a week or 2 pence a month, but 2 pence was a lot. If you've got 6 children and you have to. So attendance didn't go from And it always had been very different, as you might imagine, between rich areas and poor areas. So the result was it accelerated a trend where the attendance rates amongst the poorest would begin to gradually rise. And Robert is right in the middle of this. He's arriving at school in 1874, so we're 2 years after the Act is at the age of 5. And when I did research on the school, I went to St John's Primary School, and he would have gone to school there, but he would have had to have paid. And the family, he'd quite a big family, and if somebody was off work, sometimes they wouldn't go. And when I did the research on the school, the head teacher had to write a report once a week, the head teacher's log. They kind of still do it now, but in those days it was compulsory, it was they had to do it in order to get paid, when the inspectors turned up. And the first item in Jean Street Primary School and St John's was attendance. Attendance was good this week, attendance was bad this week. And when you dig into it, you find out that attendance in the 1870s, when my grandfather, from an immigrant family, remember, he's literally, mother and father are off the boat. Could they read and write? Probably not. Maybe not, But I suspect their education would have been limited and perhaps non-existent. So chances are his mother and father don't read and write, or certainly don't read and write well. And there's every likelihood, from what I understand of him laterally, he could read and write, but not very well. So I suspect he's one of these people who would have gone to school occasionally, because one of the things you would read about in the head teacher's logs was that attendance was poor, bad weather. And you think to yourself, so bad weather, if you had no shoes, and many of the children would have no shoes. And you've seen pictures of schools even in the 1920s, a lot of the children wouldn't have shoes on, and it's icy outside. Attendance was poor, measles. But in those days, you didn't send your child to school because a measles outbreak, we didn't have the herd immunity, which is a horrible phrase, but it sums it up beautifully, that we have today. So you'd send your child to school and there's 6, 7, 8 children in the school with measles. She could catch it and die from it, as they did. Mm-hmm. Sometimes if there was an outbreak of whooping cough, for example, the school was closed. So in those days, what you would find is that large numbers of children wouldn't go to school, sometimes at the slightest excuse. So there was bad weather, but there was another one I read, which was a lovely wee story. It was written by the head teacher, wrote it and said, attendance was poor on Monday and declined through Tuesday and Wednesday. He closes the school on the Wednesday afternoon so that the average attendance rate doesn't fall any further. So his education would have been also quite narrow, because in Catholic schools at that point, the teachers were much less well qualified. There were fewer of them, and they were less well paid because they weren't well qualified. So what you had was the poorest element in all of Scottish, west of Scotland we're talking about largely, deciding under the 1872 Act to retain their own schools in inferior buildings with inferior teachers, to pay 2p a week rather than have it free, rather than go send their children to a better built school with better qualified teachers for nothing. Why would you do that? Religious zeal? Maybe. Some of the state schools, the head teachers wouldn't take the Catholic children in. Now, in theory they couldn't do that. Legally they couldn't do it, but in practice it wasn't hard. So you had a number of things going on at the same time. You had perhaps a resentment of more recent immigrants coming in from Ireland, taking jobs, even though new workers were needed. So there was that divide. It was underscored by religion, then it's underscored by a separate form of education. And it's probably no wonder that we've still got the remains of that here. So it's probably no surprise, and it also serves to illustrate just how far back in history your own views and attitudes go. You know, at the age of 11, when I was 11, talking about 1962, we were all taken into the school canteen and we sat 2 exams. One in the morning, it was one, and it was the next day or the afternoon, I can't remember, something like that. One was a general knowledge, a question on general knowledge and English and maths. And the next day we sat IQ tests. You would get a sequence of symbols, and you had to work out what the next one was, that kind of thing. So, and on the basis of those tests, you were divided into 2 groups. 3/4 of the group would go to the local junior secondary school, which was St Stephen's just up here. And 1/4 or even 1/5 would go to the senior secondary school, which was in Greenock. And the idea was that you went to senior secondary school, you would go on and do all grades and higher, whereas St Stephen's didn't do those. In other words, the 4/5 that went to St Stephen's would leave at the age of 15 and go on to the arts. I was usually in the A class out of 5 A, B, C, D, E. I was at the bottom of it. So it would have been quite easy statistically for me to have gone to the junior secondary school. And at the minute, nobody would have batted an eyelid, and I would have gone into the shipyards and become a welder or a plater and become unemployed at the age of 30 odds in 1980. And what would I be doing now? And it's wee changes, wee decisions. Somebody could have been, a teacher could have been marking that, my paper, and I could have got an arithmetic sum right or wrong, but my writing might have been bad, and she would have been marking, she's by that time, and gave me the benefit of the doubt. And all of a sudden I've passed, and my life goes in that direction. Or she said, no, that's wrong, and I go that way. And it's very, very small things like that that's why I've got a real dislike of anything that divides people artificially, blocks off their life chances. Quite involved with that. When I became a teacher, started in 1974, I went, the first teaching job I had for a year was up in St Stephen's, the one at the top of the street here, and that was the first year where all of the children hadn't been divided. Now, the Act came in as 68, so it would have been 1969, 73, yes. So the 4th years, and the school leaving age was raised in 1973 as well. So the year I started was the first year you had all of the children from Port Glasgow, no matter how bright they were or not bright, coming in and staying on to 4th year and sitting exams.
What advice would you give to someone who wants to start tracing their own family tree?
Absolutely, without doubt, get involved in a group. Do it with other people. People who do this kind of research tend to be retired. People who are 60 plus, not working anymore. The social contact's important. You know, it's important, for example, I could have done all of this research myself. It's far better to get involved in a group and come along because, first of all, there's a social aspect. Secondly, there's expertise. Something as I've alluded to earlier in our group. The level of knowledge and technical expertise in there is impressive, very, very impressive. And you get stories, and you get this kind of thing. Would I have sat at home, which I could have done, put the camera on to myself and started talking? I would have done that. So you wind up with that kind of story, and you've got a product to the end. You're not just sitting with bits of paper trying to get your family interested, because I show these to my sons, and yes, they are interested, because you can't help but be interested in your own family. But unless I had the stories and the anecdotes and all of the rest of it, so I would certainly advise anyone to get involved in the project. There are a number of them. Anyway, is that us?
That's us, yes.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. That was